So today's video is going to be something a little bit unusual for me to be talking about, but it was a question put forward by the patrons. Torpex. Now, honestly, Torpex is a very interesting piece of development going on because Torpex is not a primary explosive. Torpex is a secondary explosive. That means it's made from two or more primary explosives being mixed together. Often with something, and in this case, exactly to something, like aluminium added in. Because, well, let's be honest, powdered aluminium, it adds so much. It does. It disturbingly does add a lot. And you get something better for it. You get something more capable. It's also a methodology of getting more from less. It allows you to, by some interesting means, get a more capable explosive with less of the very expensive ingredients or very difficult to get hold of ingredients. So it's a secondary explosive. Now, one of the interesting things we're going to be talking about today is the length of development of explosives and the fact that some of these systems realistically don't like to talk about their names, don't come out a lot, and the people involved in their creation might be a bit late in telling the world exactly where they are and what they're doing. But I will say this is not going to be a long video for me. This won't be a long video because there are limits of what I will and won't say about explosives being produced. Perhaps because this is a history channel, and whilst I'm quite happy to give you the history of the stuff and explain some of the things to do with the chemical process and some of the things to do with the making, it's not really my area of specialty. And as much as I know it from an observer's perspective rather than a participant's perspective. And so there's only so much I can really say before I start just parroting the words of others. There are some good science channels out there, and actually if there's someone you really do want to talk to about this, and I do keep nagging him to set up a channel, if you go down below you'll find there's a shipshape group list. And you'll notice that there's no channel for Boom Boom Dan, for Dan Calden, a very nice chemist who works out with shipshape. If anyone could give you a practical and pragmatic demonstration of how to make these systems and what they do, it would be him. And I keep suggesting he do it, and so far he hasn't yet followed my very strong suggestions. So, should you wish someone to do this in a very educational manner, with no gratuitous blowing things up, of course, go to the shipshape profile for the shipshape group, look at Dan, and start sending messages through the shipshape site to him. There are various contact details. Just email them through and they'll be passed on. He's also in my Discord server when he checks Discord. Please go do it. With that being said, TNT! It's dynamite! Now, trinitrotoluene was actually made by a guy called Julius Wilbrand, who's a German chemist. He's making it because he wants to make a dye, a yellow dye, and believe it or not, you can still get shirts which are trinitrotoluene yellow. I'm not sure if they are made with actual TNT. I'm hoping they are not. I'm hoping it's just yellow. But I'm not buying one just in case. I don't want that on my clothes or in my bag should I go through an airport. I just don't want to accidentally pack the wrong shirt, okay? But leaving that to one side, the process is quite simple for the time. Toluene is nitrated with a mixture of sulfuric and nitric acid first, and this produces mononitrotoluene. Chemists do have their own frigging language, I swear. Then the mononitrotoluene is separated and then renitrated to become dinitrotoluene. And then the dinitrotoluene is nitrated again to become trinitrotoluene. And that's done to it using a mixture of nitric acid and oleum. In fact, to be precise, an anhydrous mixture. Chemistry. So nitric acid is actually consumed during the manufacturing process, but the sulfuric acid keeps being reconcentrated and reused, and yeah, it's a fun system to have. In fact, one of the reasons why the Americans take the time they do to adopt trinitrotoluene, TNT, it's dynamite after all, is because that it takes a while for them to build up the industrial chemical capacity that can remove enough xylene and other things like it from the toluene feedstock and make it easier for them to actually make the stuff. So that's one of the reasons why they keep to explosive D for as long as they do. The thing that was really good about trinitrotoluene is that it was stable. You're able to pour it while it's liquid. You're able to make molds. It's wonderful. And the fact is, this isn't really noticed until 1891. If you think about it, it's first discovered in 1863. So it's out being a lovely dye for roughly 20 plus years. And the fact is, even when it is discovered, it's considered so functionally inert that it's actually exempt from the UK's Explosive Act of 1875. It's still in 1910 for the purposes of manufacture and storage. It's not considered explosive from the purposes of manufacture and storage by the UK regulations at the time in 1910, which does make things interesting in World War I. It really does. The Germans were the first to really think, oh, this could be military applicable, and they start filling artillery shells from 1902 onwards. Especially armor-piercing shells for battleships, and it was found that theirs would have penetrate the British ship's armor far more deeply than the lyddite. The British used lyddite for quite a while, and that has a habit of going boom on first contact, whereas the TNT was more stable, so would penetrate before going boom. It's rather useful. But the British had started to replace lyddite with TNT from 1907 onwards, and so their shells also have more and more TNT in them. The Americans, well, they decided to have grades of B and A TNT, and they used them for different things. They like to use burster charges with crude grade B TNT, as they would call it. That they call it crude when it's so refined is quite disturbing, but that's the US government's approach to these things at this point. And there is, fundamentally, when you're considering how they're describing it and the process they're taking it, there is something crude about Type B TNT versus Type A TNT. Type A TNT is what you're putting in your high explosive shells as the actual explosive, and you take that incredibly carefully. Whereas Type B, well, it's the burster charge. You need it to work. It just needs to be effective enough to work. Anything else doesn't really matter, so you're not really going to worry about, the powder, about the liquid, about all the things that come from it. And the other thing you have to remember, though, about trinitrotoluene is that it melts at 81 degrees centigrade. That's 178 degrees Fahrenheit. So you have to still be quite careful about storage. Very careful about storage, realistically. But it is useful. And it keeps on being used. And this is German production in World War II. Thousands of tons of TNT per month. Because it worked. And that's your criteria at the point. You're looking for something which works. Which leads us to RDX. Now beware, there is going to be some more chemistry coming up. See, RDX, or Research Department Explosive, or Royal Demolition Explosive, is actually known as cyclonite, which is more properly known as cyclotrimethylene trinitramine. Cyclotrimethylene trinitramine. And pretty much it's one of those explosives and chemicals which has been around for a while, but people haven't yet tested it. And there are all sorts of discussions about when it's first discovered and when it's first discovered explosive materials, but pretty much when we're talking about RDX, which is one of the base components of Torpex, we're talking about the 1930s, we're talking about the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, and we're talking about them doing a lot of investigation into this. And their main reasons they're trying to investigate is they're trying to provide better depth charges, because they're looking at weapons to use against U-boats and submarines. And there are various submarines that were being built apparently with thicker hulls to go deeper and also make them more stronger at resisting damage from things like depth charges. So yeah, they're working on them. And basically the idea was to develop an explosive which was more energetic than TNT for the same volume and same mass. Now RDX, Research Development Explosive, comes because, rather like water tanks become main battle tanks, because the Royal Navy and Britain as a whole is trying very hard to make it look like they are doing nothing. Because the last thing they want is for their opponents and potential opponents to realise they might be doing something, that they might actually be developing stuff, that they might actually be working on something. This is despite the fact that the British quite obviously are doing stuff, because, well, they have quite so many and quite so such greater breadth of industry and infrastructure devoted to development of weapons and explosives, but, you know, they still try and pretend, they try very hard to pretend, that they are doing nothing. That they are doing nothing. And the Royal Arsenal is a great place to be doing this in, because it's a massive facility at this point. It is a long-running facility, it has lots of buildings in it, and so that means you can spread out within those buildings without creating much noise. As in, you don't need to go building new facilities, things which will stick out to people wandering by, those sort of things. You can use stuff inside, nice and safe. Now, realistically, a lot of work had been done on RDX to make it more as cheap as possible and as useful as possible for being used as an explosive. But the trouble is, it's incredibly expensive. RDX is very, very expensive, which is why, more often than not, despite it being quite stable, it was not used as an explosive on its own. It was normally used as a component in a secondary explosive, because it's really expensive. It's really, really expensive. And that is a problem. That is a problem when it comes to explosives, because you're quite literally blowing them up. And whilst maybe having a few bombs of a very expensive type is useful, you know, if you're only making a few of them, well, it can be very useful. But if you're going to be manufacturing bombs and shells and mines and torpedoes by the literal 10,000 ton, and some of the orders are literally phrased in terms of 10,000 tons worth of batches of 10,000 tons worth of explosives, yeah, RDX is a good way to go bankrupt. RDX is an expensive process, even at the best of times, and it's a difficult process at the best of times in this period with the technology available. And so you start working on it. You start thinking, how can we do things? And well, that's where we get to the shameless book plug. But we'll get to the further story of Torpex after it. Now, this possibly could be one of the most short videos I've ever done. And that's quite literally because the amount of books you can find which are decent books giving you decent details about the development of torpedoes and explosives are rare. And even some of the good historical books out there, which I would say you'd find interesting to read. There's Colin Baxter's The Secret History of RDX, which was published by the University of Press of Kentucky, if I remember correctly. I do have a copy somewhere, but I can't find it. I think it's still in my box of books. This is the trouble, when you realise that, unlike in my old office, I do currently have approximately half my book collection out, whereas in my old office, when I was packing up, I realised I was about a quarter to a third of my books. I now have about half, but that means I still have another half sitting in boxes, mostly behind over that way, but also up there as well. Which means there are quite literally boxes I need to go through, which we'll get to when the house is fully made. But, yeah. Secret History of RDX. Do I agree with everything in it? No. I don't. Colin, if you're watching this, it's a great book. But I'm another historian. In the nicest way, I don't think you'll ever find one who will agree with everything in that. I think the thing is, and I think this is the problem once you start writing a book, I know this from my own experience of writing this, you are to an extent constrained by what you can find proof for, what you can find archival and documentary evidence for. As I've said before in my own videos, I can put in videos, well, this is what's available in archive material, and this is my gut instinct. And I can draw that line. And I can draw it very visibly on a video, and emphatically. I can't put that in a book. That's not allowed to be put in a book. That's not allowed. You can't put it in. You can go in terms of you can argue analysis. You can't argue, well, this is a fact I cannot prove, but it's the only way the rest of these facts make sense if that fact exists. You can't do that in a book. Not in a history book. You're supposed to give people quotable, reliable material that they can guarantee upon in a book. That's my view anyway. And so, I have a strong suspicion when it comes to Colin's work that there are bits in there which he can't write. As much as his gut instinct might be saying, he can't write. But it was published in 2018 and it was a very good read to have sitting around during COVID, actually. I'd also say this. The British have a rather large number of organisations involved in the development of these materials going on. They have a lot of work, a lot of labs working on explosives. As do the Americans. The British ones had been around for a long time. I don't want to quite get into this, but if you consider the Royal Arsenal, well, that was founded at some point in the late 17th century. That's 1600s, late 1600s. About, it's a good time. There had already been a gun warfare and various other things before then, but it's about 1651 that they are starting proving guns and starting work, and it carries on from there and keeps going. We're going to be talking about another thing in a second called Walton Abbey, the Royal Gunpowder Mills, which were also involved in development. And, well, that site was originally set up in the 1780s. 1780s. So we're saying that the British government has these massive labs, these facilities sitting around working for hundreds of years, trying to get better explosives, trying to get better gunpowder, trying to try all sorts of things. And yes, there are going to be many failures. There are going to be many failures on their path to success, and there's the whole development of scientific method of various other things going on. But that's also, to me, means that when I look at some of the stats and dates given over things and the exact forms given, I do wonder about it. You see, I think the issue might be, especially might be, that in terms of explosives, when you're starting to give out information, if I was running the show, and this again is a hypothetical, because if I was running the show, I'd only announce something when I'd already worked out how to A, mass produce it, or B, if mass producing it was economically viable. Announcing RDX when they did, and being involved in it when they did, suddenly gave everyone an unobtainium of explosives. It's incredibly expensive to produce, and everyone could be obsessed with it at that point. But by that point, the British were already, when it's announced, well, the details get a bit fuzzy. But still, if you want to hear more like this and more discussions, please like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. And that's my book. Travels, Battles and Darings. Development of the Modern Destroyer. More books coming soon. Anyway, this is where we get to Torpex, because, you see, as we all know, the British officially end the 10-year rule in 1932. The treaty system collapses in 1937. That's also when the Treasury finally actually releases funding. And so the 10-year rule actually ends. The British are planning on a lot of things for 1942. There's the Hunt-class escort destroyers, the Flower-class corvettes, all being ordered, and the Black Swans, all being ordered in 1939. Before war begins, they've all been ordered, they're all being designed, laid down. It's hoped war won't begin till 1942 or after. That was what the Navy was building up to. That's what the Navy have kept being told. Despite the fact that they've been pointing guns at the Japanese, and Japanese are pointing guns at them regularly. And the Germans are doing, well, what the Germans are doing, and the Italians have been doing lots of things. But leaving that to one side, Torpex is being developed. And Torpex is a special mixture of RDX, TNT, and powdered aluminium. You see, RDX and TNT, they produce and have a negative oxygen balance, and this affects an explosive. It affects how long it will burn for. It affects its expansion time especially. I.e., how much expansion, how much distance, how much effect it'll have. Now, if you mix in aluminium powder, well, its superheated form tends to expand and extend the expansion time of the gases. They also add in beeswax to reduce sensitivity to shock and impact of the final form, because when you do add in aluminium powder, that can have effect on the stability. Believe it or not, RDX, fairly stable on its own. TNT, fairly stable on its own. Mix them together. It's going to be stable, but okay. Add in aluminium powder. Oh, suddenly you've got potential for issues. Add in beeswax as what's called a phlegmatizing agent. It helps. Later, beeswax is replaced by things like paraffin wax, and then they also add in calcium chloride because, well, the explosives have a habit of absorbing moisture, which can lead to the production of hydrogen gas when they're humid. Again, all things you want to avoid, and all things you have to test out and work out quite a long way in advance before you start really manufacturing these things, because otherwise you're going to end up with a whole load of bombs and shells and torpedoes you can't use. And this does seem to be focused on developing something for service in 1942. Saying that, there is a small critical issue with this being an explosive which is being designed, developed, and available from 1942 onwards. Just a tiny issue. A tiny issue. Not a massive issue, but there's a tiny thing which does make me think about that. And the Germans do have their own equivalent of Torpex, which was Trilan. But we'll leave that to one side. And that is the fact that there are some very interesting designs going on. Some very interesting designs. Designs which include a torpedo which was realistically shaped around and designed to enter service some point after 1939. Now, most of the big bombs, etc., you hear about, they are later. They are certainly 1942, roughly. Although the design work's going on earlier. But Torpex was originally for torpedoes. And there are 18-inch torpedoes and 21-inch torpedoes. Well, the Mark 9 dash star 21-inch torpedo. All undergoing a lot of work in the late 1930s. And in fact, if you look at the lovely torpedo known as the Mark 9, the 21-inch Mark 9, It doesn't get fully utilized till a new engine and a Torpex warhead is inserted, because though the shaping and internal spaces seem to be designed more around those necessarily than TNT. In fact, whilst there is certainly an argument that they were designing for weapon systems which were coming, there is an argument that they seem to have understood those weapon systems well enough already when they are designing for them that it's going to work. It does give an interesting thing because, well, Torpex is 50% more powerful pound for pound than TNT. 50%. That's useful. And if we think again through some of the events of World War II, some of the battles, some of the famous torpedo damages done by the Royal Navy's destroyers and aircraft, etc., if they'd been using Torpex torpedoes for those operations instead of TNT torpedoes, well, the world could have been a very different place. And realistically, they could have been. If war, I think, had held off for just a few months more, then there would have been a lot of systems ready to go into service. And once again, one of the problems you have when you enter war is you have people like good old Churchill who have these wonderful blanket ideas about what you should do and how you should pause certain things and just concentrate on fighting the war, because the war otherwise could be over before you're able to get into it properly. He's not quite saying that, but the pausing of capital ship and carrier construction, cruiser construction, and all sorts of development materials for the Navy when he becomes First Lord of the Admiralty again is straight out of the World War I book. And realistically, in World War I, it's arguable it needed to happen because of the way the Navy had been structured and things that were going on. But the Navy of World War II is not the Navy of World War I. The people in charge of development of the Navy and procurement for the Navy had been as far away from Jackie Fisher as you can physically possibly imagine in terms of their approach to systems, and had ordered a lot of small ships and had all these things coming along. And some of this stuff coming in would have been mighty useful. It really would have been. Because, if we put it into simple terms, a 18-inch torpedo, as was used at Taranto or Cape Matapan, with Torpex rather than TNT in it, has the equivalent of 582 pounds of TNT rather than 388 pounds of TNT that historically they do. And that makes for bigger bangs. Every single one of those detonations, every single one of those hits causes more damage. Cape Matapan, the battleship might have been slowed down enough that, frankly, it ends up not being just a cruiser three cruisers caught in the dark, but an entire Italian squadron caught by the Royal Navy in the dark. That could have been painful. That could have been painful. Especially if they managed to cold cock them at such close range again. If they do that, then it's a nasty fight, don't get me wrong. The Italians will score some nasty wins as well in that, because it'll be such a close quarter fight, but it'll be decimating because of the way it'll happen, because the British will get, if the British get as close as they did historically. Yes, that's just not something you want to think about. And also, that will be building on whatever happened at Taranto, which would have been, again, far more damaging. If you go through and you add 50% more explosive onto every torpedo, every mine, every system that hits from 1939 onwards from the British on their opponents, it starts to rack up quite quickly. It's a really interesting point to consider. But why wasn't it implemented more quickly? Why wasn't it available? Why wasn't it delivered more quickly? Why wasn't it more available? It's production of RDX. They had worked out the Woolwich method. They had this idea of how they could develop it, how they could implement it. But the trouble is, the world had gone to war too soon. 3 more years, And the British arms manufacture industry doesn't look the same as it does in 1939. It would have looked very, very different. It would have spread out even more. And the Woolwich method of RDX production would have, well, been well and truly established. As it was in 1941, the Tizard mission visits the US Army, Navy, and Canada. And they explained the Woolwich method, and they explain the stabilization by mixing it with beeswax, and they explain that they need 220 tons, that's 440,000 pounds of RDX a day to prosecute the war. And that's what leads to a lot of developments and a lot of works. And eventually it leads to the development of the Bachmann process, which is a continuous flow process for RDX using the lovely ammonium nitrate nitric acid mixture as the nitrating agent, and all sorts of other things going on. And that system is developed because of the experience of the Woolwich system and because of the experience of what they're implementing it, so they can actually produce even more RDX. These are the sort of things you developed and you work on as you develop the process, as you get these things working. And so it's by 1942 that you start getting the weapons being deployed. You get the depth charges containing Torpex, which are much more destructive, much more capable of being dropped on U-boats and annihilating them. If they hit, of course. That's always the case when they hit. And that's really the history of RDX, the history of these explosives. It's a quick history, it's going through it, but the point is, this is one of those systems of, oh, we've got a lot of development going on. We've had a lot of years of development and study, and it's finally coming to fruition, and then frigate war hits. And suddenly you have to scale up production of what's in service instead of transitioning to something new in production, because that would take your production down. And what's more important is you have weapons now than they're necessarily the best weapons you could actually produce. This is one of the points I try and make about technology in war, is that more often technology in war slows down in terms of development, it increases in terms of implementation. And that's what realistically is going on. So yeah, well, the question will make it an easy one. What happens if the British do get it after have it running by 1939? If the British have managed to make the switch over to production and have got enough RDX going through, probably by the Woolwich process, but probably in the process of updating the Woolwich process, because after you've run it for a while, you very quickly start to realise that something like the Bachmann process makes sense. It is a natural evolution of what you're dealing with, but it will be more difficult for Britain specifically to implement that, considering the materials they have access to, but not impossible. Not impossible. So, what do you think happens if the British, let's say, have it in service from 1938 and manage to switch over to it? If you do have all the torpedoes, all the bombs, everything you can being Torpex, everything the Navy's using, shells included, all the shells filled with Torpex. I don't think we'd probably go as far as shells with Torpex. It sounds like something which is going to blow up your gun. I don't think we'll go with shells. We'll go with everything else. Putting Torpex in shells sounds like a very, very bad scenario to me. Anyway, I'd love to hear your opinions and what you think would happen. What else have we got coming up? Well, next week we have the RN's... Well, we've had this week the RN's views on US Carrier Task Force leadership, courtesy of this book. And next week we've got Leadership of Liberty. Oh, cool. That'll be fun. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. If you like the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and thank you. Take care.